An electromotive diesel, originally General Motors Electromotive Division, model SD70 ACE. What it is, it's a 4,000 horsepower freight locomotive. Notice it has 6 axles, 3 in front, 3 in back. You want more axles for more lower speed pulling power. Passenger engines don't need that because their trains are lightweight. I mean, even a large Amtrak train only weighs about 1,200 tons. Whereas a large freight train can weigh 13,000 to 15,000 tons, or the equivalent of a heavy cruiser in World War II. So you have more wheels on the rail, more pulling power, what they call tractive effort. Now, how this locomotive is laid out, one, you have a much bigger fuel tank, because you're going to be burning more fuel and going further between fuel stops. Once again, you've got a fuel filler and a sight glass on here, including an emergency fuel cutoff valve right here, and a digital readout of how much fuel is actually in the tank. So right now it's just over half full, and since the engine is shut down, you don't have anything showing on that because the electronics are all turned off. Looks like our freight train's getting ready to start moving again over there. That was a quick fuel change. The fuel tank goes completely under the engine, and these are the air reservoirs here, and they're on both sides of the engine. The actual diesel motor is right behind this section of the long hood. This is the flared radiator section for cooling the water that cools the engine. You notice these engines aren't running, they're not idling. Now, if it was wintertime, these engines would be idling. You never shut down a diesel electric locomotive if the temperature outside is much below about 40 to 42 degrees. Diesel electric locomotives, the big motor called a prime mover, the block, is not a block. It's a hollow rack welded together. There's potential for an interaction between the cooling water and the lubricating oil. Diesel locomotives do not have antifreeze in them. Antifreeze breaks down lubricating oil. So if the engine's going to be shut down in the winter, they have to drain all the cooling water out of the engine. That, on this engine's somewhere above 300 gallons of cooling water. Probably closer to 400 on this size engine. Because if you don't, a safety valve on the engine, which measures outside air temperature, will open a valve and dump all the cooling water out on the tracks to prevent freeze-up. They had some really nasty freeze-up experiences with the early diesels back in the 40s and 50s, and after that they began to put the safety valves on. As a result, that protects the intricate motor and cooling system from being destroyed by having water burst in the pipes. So that's why in the summer we can turn these engines off, because you don't have to worry about the outside air temperature. But come back in the wintertime, you'll see diesel engines sitting around the terminal, and they're all idling. And that's the reason they are. At low idle, they don't burn much fuel. Now, right up here, this is the breathing air of the locomotive. This is the intake that goes into the turbocharger. That makes the 4,000 plus horsepower possible on a locomotive of this basic type. You can see here, again, the sand tubes going down to put traction sand in front and back of the trucks, the wheel sets. See this accordion-like structure right here? That's a duct. There are blowers that blow cool air on the electric traction motors to keep them cool. Those things can get really hot pulling a heavy train. You always have a traction motor blower. Batteries are kept in here, as well as braking equipment under the cab. The year 1989, all of UP's heritage engines are numbered for the year that particular railroad ceased to exist through merger. Now, in the case of the Denver and Rio Grande Western Road, it's a little bit more complex. UP never took over Rio Grande. The Rio Grande bought the Southern Pacific in 1989, but assumed the Southern Pacific corporate name because it was more well known. It wasn't until 1996 that the Southern Pacific, which combined with the old Rio Grande, was taken over by Union Pacific. But that was the year Rio Grande ceased to exist, so this engine is UP 1989 in honor of the year the Rio Grande ceased to exist as a separate corporate entity, even though it was still several more years before it became a part of the official Union Pacific family. Now this is the old Rio Grande emblem on the side. This was the newer emblem that was still in existence up to 1989. The locomotive has the Rio Grande speed lettering on the side with what they call the flying Rio Grande, with those little things coming off the top of the R and the D. That style was adopted by Southern Pacific starting in 1989, and you still occasionally will see a gray, red-nosed, gray and white SP engine with a UP number spray painted over under the cab, but it has what they call the flying lettering. It says Southern Pacific instead of Rio Grande. So any questions about the freight unit? I'm just going to briefly mention these two, and we'll go over to the historic locomotive section. Any questions? Okay, this locomotive here is called a GP15. It's a small switching and branch line locomotive that was offered by General Motors in the early and mid-1980s to help railroads replace their older engines like this GP9 down here on the right. This engine used a lot of components off the older 1950s diesels and therefore cost less for railroads. You know, it's interesting, the original diesel freight engines were about $150,000 to $180,000 an engine. By 1966, they were up to around $300,000 an engine. An engine like that, right there, the Rio Grande engine today, would be almost $3 million a locomotive. So when you have a locomotive that's only going to be used short distances or for switching in the yard or on branch lines of marginal profitability, you want an engine that isn't going to put you back a couple of $1 million. Engines like this were a lot cheaper because they used rebuilt components out of older locomotives, but they were newer and more reliable. Basically, this is a 1980s version of that locomotive right there, the GP9. The GP9 was the most mass-produced of the first-generation diesels, those built between the 30s and 1960. The GP9 came out in 1954 and was produced till 1959. Southern Pacific had over 300 of them, and some of those are still running on little short lines and small private railroads around the country today. The General Motors built a very reliable, long-lasting locomotive. The GP15s here came out in the early mid-80s. In fact, right over there near the old ice house, there are two of them switching freight cars. I saw them just a few minutes ago. This is the main style of Union Pacific switch engine used here in Utah in the freight yards on branch lines. This railroad is Utah Central. They operate a lot of former Rio Grande branches out here on the west side of Ogden over by the old sugar mill. As I said, the GP9 there is one of the original locomotives that the museum got back in the 80s when those engines were being finally phased out. It has 5 headlights on the front. The red light on top only came on if the train went into emergency braking. If there was a problem or a derailment, if a train was coming the other direction, they would see that gyrating red light and know to stop immediately so they didn't run into the train having the problem. The 2 headlights that stick out, they're in an oval mounting. Right below the red light is a gyro light that went in a conical pattern every second or so. That warned motorists. Remember, I talked about the 2 headlights in my presentation. The top one was an old-fashioned Mars light, or later a gyrating light, to warn motorists at crossings. The bottom 2 headlights are the actual light that lit up the track up to 2,500 feet out in front of the engine. Today, the locomotives do not have gyrating lights, and I think, frankly, from a railroader's perspective, that's a mistake. In the late 1980s, they began to adopt these headlights down low called ditch lights. This is a Canadian innovation from the late 1960s. Up in Canada, out in the middle of nowhere, the main headlight has a null area about 500 feet in front of the engine where it provides very little light. The headlight lights up about 2,000 feet down the track, but you had an area in front of the locomotive that didn't have much light. So the Canadians began putting those lights down low that would light up the area right in front of the engine in the little ditches alongside the track. Now that is a federal requirement on all American locomotives. It started in Canada, just like the full-width cab once again started in Canada after they had abandoned that idea back in the late 50s. The problem with these lights is if you're in the fog and you're looking out in the fog and you see a bunch of blobs of light, when one of them gyrated, you knew it was a train. when all of them are steady, you don't know whether it's a bright street light, a train, or whatever. But they got rid of the gyrating lights because anything mechanical and moving like that was an additional expense, that if that light didn't work, the federal government required that engine be taken out of service immediately because not all of its safety equipment was running. So it was a cost savings effort in the 1980s when the railroads were suffering financially.